Timo van Laar was a football legend in the making, adored by millions, while Serafina Drost was the trusted assistant who knew all his secrets. Until one chose betrayal and the other chose crime. Together, their names would ignite one of the most shocking drug scandals in European sports history, revealing how a beloved Dutch star traded stadium glory for cocaine millions and a prison cell. Timo van Laar was born in the heart of Rotterdam, where apartment blocks stretched toward gray skies and football was more than just a game. It was a religion. From an early age, he stood out among the neighborhood kids, not just for his skill but for his fierce drive. While others played for fun, Timo played to escape. His father, a construction worker with bad knees, believed in discipline, and his mother, a night shift nurse, held the family together with quiet strength. They believed in Timo's talent, but they couldn't afford fancy academies. Instead, he trained in abandoned lots, wore second-hand boots, and practiced until his legs gave out. Coaches began noticing. At just 15, he joined the youth team of a mid-tier club. Within 2 years, he was scouted by Feyenoord's senior team, and by 19, he had made his professional debut. The city embraced him like a son. With each goal he scored, Timo's face appeared on more billboards. He was the boy who made it. Brands offered endorsement deals, and magazines called him the future of Dutch football. Known for his pinpoint passes and fearless tackles, Timo played with heart. But behind the fame was a growing storm. The pressure to perform, maintain appearances, and stay perfect began to weigh on him. He masked his exhaustion with energy drinks and painkillers, injuries hidden behind tightly wrapped ankles. He didn't want to let anyone down. Not his family, not his fans, and certainly not himself. When he injured his right knee in a match against PSV Eindhoven, it seemed like a small setback. But scans revealed ligament damage that would sideline him for months. The media speculated about his career longevity. Sponsors hesitated. Suddenly, the same people who had celebrated him began to whisper that maybe Timo's star had burned too fast. For the first time, he felt invisible in a world that once worshipped him. He withdrew from the spotlight, retreating into a lifestyle he could barely afford. High-end shopping, exclusive nightclubs, and private trips to Ibiza, each an attempt to fill the silence left by fading fame. Debt crept in quietly. He borrowed against his future contracts, gambled away bonuses in underground poker rooms, and found himself surrounded by people who cared more about his status than his soul. That was when Jairo Versluis entered his life. Jairo wasn't a football agent or a trainer. He wore gold chains over silk shirts and drove cars more expensive than most houses. Timo met him at a luxury yacht party off the coast of St. Tropez. Jairo knew everyone worth knowing and seemed to understand exactly what Timo needed. A way out, a second chance at control. At first, Jairo's offer seemed innocent. Promotional appearances, travel gigs, and investment opportunities overseas. There were no contracts, just handshakes and promises. Money came quickly. Too quickly. 1 week, Timo received 50,000 to pose for photos in Curaçao for a youth sports program. The next, he was asked to transport training gear in his luggage. It felt suspicious, but the rush of cash drowned his doubt. He told himself he was helping fund grassroots football. That he was giving back. That the guilt was just stress. He didn't tell his family. Not his mother, who still watched every match rerun with pride. Not his manager, who had begun to question his frequent absences. Timo had become addicted, not to drugs, but to the feeling of being needed again. Jairo made him feel valuable, important, in control. But behind the sunglasses and smiles, Jairo's world was darker than Timo realized. Surveillance, threats, silent expectations. Once the football star accepted the money, walking away became impossible. Every trip he took, every handshake he made, tied him deeper into a web he didn't fully understand. The goals, the fans, the stadium chants, all began to blur as his real life shifted away from the pitch and toward something far more dangerous. By the time the knee healed, Timo had already changed. He returned to training, but his eyes were different. Distracted, cold. He still played well, but not with the same fire. Because now, football was just a mask. Underneath it, a secret grew. One that could cost him everything. Timo's descent into the criminal underworld didn't happen overnight. It unfolded quietly, like a slow, moving fog, until he couldn't see the line between right and wrong anymore. After that first trip to Kuras, the money kept flowing. Every time he opened his offshore account, the numbers climbed. He had never seen that kind of wealth before. Not from football, not from sponsorships. The football world applauded his sudden interest in community development. News outlets praised his philanthropic efforts, and fans believed their star had a heart as golden as his talent. No one suspected that the foundation he fronted, Future Goals Initiative, was a shell. It had no programs, no staff, and no mission, except to move product disguised as humanitarian aid. At first, Timo stayed one step removed. He made appearances at events, posed for cameras with local children, and signed footballs meant to cover the scent of the cocaine hidden underneath the gear. He didn't load the containers. He didn't book the flights. He only smoothed transactions between two worlds that rarely touched organized crime and global celebrity. His fame made him untouchable, or so he believed. Gyro vs. Lewis encouraged the illusion. He sent Timo elegant suits, offered him private jets, and introduced him to European socialites who adored him. But underneath all the glitter was something darker. Every meeting had eyes watching. Every transaction came with a warning. The people behind Gyro weren't running a business. They were running an empire, and Timo had unknowingly become one of its generals. As Timo's involvement deepened, so did his paranoia. He began memorizing new code words. Training sessions meant shipments. Match day meant a delivery deadline. Red card meant a missing package. He installed secure messaging apps, carried burner phones, and avoided certain airports with tighter customs. Yet every step made him feel powerful. For a young man used to being adored for goals and passes, the new thrill of managing secret operations filled a different void. His home in Amsterdam became the unofficial headquarters. On the surface, it was a luxurious bachelor pad with views of the canal and artwork from Italian galleries. But behind one mirrored wall, there was a hidden compartment filled with unmarked envelopes, encrypted hard drives, and counterfeit documents. Timo learned how to move silently, how to pay off port workers, and how to arrange insurance for risky deliveries. With Gyro's backing, he could influence flight routes, customs clearances, and even bribe lower-level officials without ever stepping into a warehouse. Meanwhile, his football career limped along. He returned to play, but not with the same fire. Coaches noticed he was distracted. He'd skip post-match interviews. He started missing practice without explanation, often claiming to be handling his foundation's affairs. The club's management didn't push too hard. Timo was still a marketing asset, even if his form had dipped. Fans chalked it up to post-injury fatigue. Only a few insiders began whispering about a change in him. His eyes had lost that old sparkle. He laughed less, spoke less, and spent more time away from his teammates. But the money blinded him. In 6 months, he had made more through laundering and logistics than his entire professional career. He bought properties under different names, including a vineyard in Spain and a penthouse in Dubai. He started recruiting others. Retired players looking for a second income, struggling club staff who knew too much, even a physiotherapist who traveled with the team and discreetly delivered packages. As his reach grew, so did his influence. He no longer needed Gyro's instructions for every deal. He started making decisions on his own, negotiating prices, even threatening lower-tier distributors who failed to meet quotas. The footballer was gone. In his place stood a man with secrets stitched into every aspect of his life. Yet, deep inside, there was still a sliver of fear. Timo had moments, brief ones, when the guilt pierced through. Like when a fan asked for an autograph and thanked him for inspiring their son. Or when his mother visited, still proud, unaware that the cars in his driveway weren't bought with clean money. But those moments passed quickly, buried under another transfer, another encrypted message, another stack of euros. He thought he was in control, that he could play both sides and never get caught. But what he didn't realize was that every move he made, every luxury he flaunted, left a trail. And somewhere, quietly, someone had started following it. The unraveling began on a foggy morning in the port city of Vlissingen, where rows of shipping containers stretched as far as the eye could see. A routine customs inspection turned into something far more serious when officers ran a standard scan on a container marked as sports equipment for youth outreach programs. Inside, they found 700 kilos of tightly packed cocaine concealed beneath soccer balls, cones, and training kits. It was the kind of bust that made headlines. But what made it extraordinary was the paperwork. The container had been leased by a non-profit registered under the name of Timo van Laar. The authorities didn't act immediately. They chose to observe, quietly building a web of surveillance around the operation. They started pulling records, flight logs, business filings, warehouse leases, and every search led back to the former football star. It was almost too perfect. Timo had left a paper trail that was clean on the surface but rotten underneath. The sports foundation, the charity shipments, the shell companies. It was all constructed to look legitimate. Yet each thread pointed to something far more organized and criminal. They began by tracking his known properties and movements. Surveillance teams monitored his sleek Amsterdam apartment, noting strange visitors arriving late at night in rented cars. At a warehouse linked to his logistics firm, cameras captured workers unloading boxes that never matched the invoices filed with customs. Every few weeks, Timo traveled to meet with supposed donors or foundation partners, always conveniently in locations that happened to be known trafficking hotspots. But the moment that shifted the investigation came from a detail so small, it almost went unnoticed. In one of the surveillance videos, a man arrived at the warehouse late at night, wearing a hoodie pulled tightly over his head. The footage was grainy, but the man's gait, his height, and the way he limped slightly on his right leg were all too familiar. Forensic analysts compared it to Timo's post-injury walk and found an uncanny match. Investigators turned their focus to his finances. What they found was staggering. Multiple accounts in Luxembourg, Belize, and Singapore. Transfers disguised as consultancy fees. Property purchases made through anonymous trusts. It became clear that the money he earned from football had long been eclipsed by his new income streams. Yet none of it was declared. And none of it made sense on a footballer's salary, especially one not at the top of his game anymore. They tapped his communication networks. Though Timo used encrypted apps, he made one mistake. He once called a storage manager using his personal number during a logistics delay. That slip gave investigators the legal grounds they needed to intercept his calls and messages. What they heard painted a grim picture. Phrases like, pitch condition good, away game confirmed, and clean sheets delivered, were not about football, they were code. Each one matched up with known delivery dates, drop locations, or successful transactions. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that Timo was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. He was calling shots, managing careers, resolving conflicts, and calculating risks. His name carried enough weight to move shipments across borders without suspicion. His reputation as a sports hero was his greatest camouflage. But cracks were starting to form. A few of his lower-tier associates had been arrested in smaller raids. Though none of them spoke out, the pressure was growing. International agencies were now involved, comparing notes and cross-referencing leads. The Dutch National Crime Squad coordinated with Interpol, and Timo's face appeared on classified internal bulletins labeled high-value target. Still, in public, Timo played the role of the troubled athlete making a comeback. He gave short interviews, promised fans he was focused on football, and occasionally posted about youth sports on social media. But behind the scenes, he was on edge. The bust in Vlissingen had rattled him. He began canceling trips, holding fewer meetings, and even moved his offshore money into gold and art, worried about traceability. But it was too late. What he didn't know was that the circle was closing around him. Someone inside his operation had turned. Someone was already feeding the police everything they needed. Every date, every delivery, every password. And Timo van Laar was about to learn that even legends can fall, especially when they believe they're untouchable. Timo van Laar had always believed his charisma was his greatest weapon. It opened doors, softened suspicions, and disguised his growing criminal empire beneath the glow of fame. But as the investigation grew tighter, he failed to realize that the weakest point in his operation wasn't the shipments, the code words, or even the shell companies. It was the people closest to him. And one of them had already switched sides. Serafina Drost had been by Timo's side since his early career. Originally hired as a personal assistant through his PR agency, she had evolved into something far more vital. She booked flights, managed appearances, handled sensitive paperwork, and made excuses to coaches when he vanished without warning. She also became his lover during his rehabilitation period, though their romance burned out fast, leaving behind something colder and more transactional. Timo trusted her, or rather, depended on her. But Serafina had her own secrets. She had grown suspicious long before she took action. At first, it was little things. Duffel bags filled with cash, stacks of burner phones hidden in false drawers, and visitors who didn't look like athletes or agents. One day, while organizing files, she stumbled across a list of offshore account numbers scribbled on a hotel notepad tucked inside a drawer marked Foundation Documents. Later, she discovered a second passport under a different name, complete with Timo's photo and falsified date of birth. The final trigger came when she overheard a hushed phone call between Timo and someone named Maz. The tone was panic, something about a shipment going dark, and cleaning up before Sunday. That night, Serafina couldn't sleep. She began copying files, photographing ledgers, and secretly logging the times of suspicious meetings. Her gut told her this was no longer just shady dealings. This was organized crime, and she was caught in the middle. She contacted a lawyer, who in turn reached out to Dutch authorities. A meeting was arranged in secret, and soon Serafina found herself sitting in a windowless room across from members of the National Crime Squad. She was offered immunity in exchange for full cooperation. She agreed. But there was a condition. Timo could never know. From that point forward, Serafina became a silent informant. She fed the authorities bank statements, shipping manifests, warehouse codes, and phone records. She was present during calls she pretended not to hear and retrieved discarded SIM cards from trash bins to hand off to agents. Everything she passed along painted a clearer picture of Timo's operation, including key players, drop locations, and international partners. The most critical tip came when she learned of a planned shipment scheduled to leave the Netherlands via a private jet from a discreet airfield outside Maastricht. The cargo was being labeled as sports performance supplies, headed for a fictional training facility in the Caribbean. The client behind the shipment was the Future Goals Initiative, and the passenger manifest included Timo himself. Authorities acted fast. They intercepted the jet in Cape Verde with local cooperation. Inside, they discovered 350 kilos of high-purity cocaine carefully in branded gym equipment. The pilot was arrested, and 2 of Timo's logistics coordinators were taken into custody hours later. It was the break investigators had waited for. Meanwhile, Timo sensed something was wrong. His calls to his inner circle went unanswered. His trusted pilot disappeared. Panic set in. He wiped his phones, dumped his laptop in a canal, and withdrew large amounts of cash from 3 different accounts. He didn't go home. He didn't call his family. Within 48 hours, he had crossed the border into Germany under a false identity and vanished. Authorities traced his movements with the help of Serafina, who provided a list of aliases and emergency contact numbers. She knew about a safe house in Austria, an isolated chalet Timo had purchased 2 years earlier under a fake corporation. The National Crime Squad coordinated with Austrian authorities for a raid. Timo was arrested at dawn. He had grown a beard, dyed his hair darker, and adopted the name Martin Elgers. But he was still wearing the same watch he wore the day he scored his first professional goal, an unmistakable trophy of a life that now felt like a distant dream. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. Back in the Netherlands, Serafina disappeared. Some say she entered witness protection. Others claim she fled the country entirely. Her betrayal had ended a multi-million-euro operation and dismantled one of the most unexpected drug networks Europe had ever seen. But it also ensured that Timo's final game would not be played on grass, but behind bars. News of Timo van Laar's arrest spread like wildfire across Europe. For days, every sports network, newspaper, and social media feed was consumed by one story: the fall of the Dutch football prodigy. Images of his glamorous lifestyle were replayed next to footage of him being led out of a mountain chalet in handcuffs, his head lowered beneath a hood, flanked by armed officers. Fans were stunned. Teammates distanced themselves. Sponsors pulled out instantly. His once celebrated name became a symbol of disgrace. But beyond the media frenzy, a more meticulous process had begun: the unraveling of everything Timo had built in the shadows. Back in the Netherlands, the authorities began piecing together the vast criminal network he had helped manage. They seized his homes, froze accounts, and raided offices tied to his fake charity. Hidden compartments revealed duffel bags filled with cash, burner phones loaded with encrypted conversations, and hand-drawn maps of drop zones marked with GPS coordinates. Each item served as a puzzle piece, confirming that Timo was not just a passive participant but a central figure in a sophisticated trafficking ring that spanned 5 countries. His trial began months later under tight security at a special court designed for high-risk cases. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence: financial documents, surveillance footage, wiretaps, and the testimony of Serafina Drost, whose appearance in court stunned the country. Hidden behind tinted glass and protected by a new identity, she gave detailed accounts of the operation, her betrayal, and the months she spent risking her life to bring Timo down. She described his methods, his contacts, and the coded language he used to avoid detection. Her testimony was chilling, precise, and left no doubt that Timo had crossed far beyond the boundary of legality. In response, Timo's defense team attempted to portray him as a vulnerable athlete manipulated by a criminal mastermind. Gyro vs. Lewis. They painted Gyro as the architect of the empire, with Timo as nothing more than a pawn trapped by threats and false promises. But the evidence said otherwise. There were voice recordings of Timo giving direct instructions, arranging shipments, and even issuing warnings to lower-level operatives. There were bank statements linking him to multiple laundering routes and shell companies. There were documents signed in his own hand, setting up offshore accounts used to hide drug money. The jury reached a decision swiftly. Timo van Laar was found guilty on multiple charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, conspiracy to smuggle controlled substances, and possession of fraudulent identification. He was sentenced to 26 years in a high-security facility in Veit, one of the most secure prisons in the Netherlands. The judge called him a man who chose greed over greatness, and noted that his actions had not only betrayed his sport, but also endangered communities across Europe through the very drugs he helped distribute. The sentencing sent ripples through the football world. Feyenoord issued a statement denouncing his actions and stripped him of all former honors. His name was removed from club records, and the charity that bore his face was dissolved. Jerseys with his number were returned in droves, burned by fans who once idolized him. Youth programs that had looked to him as a role model were forced to confront the reality that their hero had been living a lie. Timo adjusted poorly to prison life. Though placed in solitary for his own protection, he struggled with isolation. Once surrounded by roaring crowds and luxury, he now sat in a gray cell with nothing but time. He read old football magazines, sometimes staring at photos of himself in action, frozen in moments that now seemed from another lifetime. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was mostly to his lawyer, who continued efforts to appeal the sentence without success. Jairo Versluis, meanwhile, vanished completely. Rumors suggested he had fled to South America, protected by the same networks that once funded Timo's empire. Interpol issued a red notice, but no confirmed sighting has been reported since Timo's arrest. For many, the mystery of Jairo remains the one loose end in a case otherwise airtight. In the end, Timo van Laar's story became a modern tragedy. A gifted athlete who could have lived as a legend chose instead a path of deception and greed. He had everything: a career, a future, a city that adored him. And in pursuit of more, he lost it all. The final whistle didn't come on a football field, but inside a courtroom, where cheers turned to silence, and glory gave way to a lifetime of regret.